Morning and hello from London. I'm not normally a great fan of anniversaries or anniversary journalism, but how wrong I was over the 10th anniversary of Raba. It had the effect of uncorking a bottle full of the stench and pain of blood and death, of a crime unpunished, of unfinished justice. This is in no small measure due to the fact that before the police started to clear the squares in Cairo, they were urged on by an awful lot of Egyptians, at least half of Cairo, the liberals and the left. There was even a statement issued by the left saying, "Where is the clearance?" The largest massacre since Tiananmen Square in 1989 was cheered on by a broad spectrum of political opinion that supported Sisi's coup and called it a second revolution. No one to this date has apologized for this, even though it must weigh heavily on their conscience. Today, guilt has morphed into denial and mass efforts to rewrite history, such as the Egyptian TV series The Choice. This depicts security officers as the good guys who are trying to end the sit-in peacefully, while people in the square are tooled up and heavily armed. Goebbels couldn't have done a better job. But just devoting time and space to this terrible event, to the massacre, which ranks in ignominy to any other massacre in the world, had an immediate effect on the regime in Cairo, and this surprised me. According to a former minister in the Egyptian government, Sisi cancelled a trip to South Africa because he feared arrest under universal jurisdiction for his role in the Raba massacre. The government troll farm on social media talked about a London plot simply because of the coverage that was given it. Again, this surprised me. It's 10 years on, but it says quite a lot about the fragility, not only of Sisi's Egypt, but the counter-revolution as a whole. Now, firstly, I think counter-revolution is the wrong word. And this is not my thought. I borrow from a man that I interviewed in Berlin recently, who played quite a big role in the January Revolution on the left, Hossam al-Hamalawi. Hamalawi has made a forensic study of the Egyptian security services under Sisi, and he makes the point they are nothing like the setup under Mubarak. If Mubarak had a divide and rule policy and set one structure against another so that no one gained the power to challenge him or his dynasty, Sisi has transformed the GIS, military intelligence, interior ministry, and the army into a security complex whose sole function is to detect and crush domestic unrest. In his analysis, the criticism of the younger generals 10 years ago who took over was that the older generation was too soft on the revolution. So counter-revolution is a wrong word if it implies that there's been a restitution of dictatorship. This autocracy is far crueler than the one that sparked the revolution in Egypt. Which brings me to my first point. Despotism, however strong, does not mean strength. Quite the opposite. Cast your mind back to what Egypt, or for that matter, Yemen, Syria, Libya, Sudan, or even Iraq was like 10 years ago, and consider the shattered nations they are now. These countries have been shattered by civil war and coups. They're on their knees economically. They have impoverished their peoples. According to the Fitch 2023 forecast, Egypt is already spending 44% of its revenues on interest payments of debt this year. Next year, this will jump to 54%, putting it third in the world, only to Sri Lanka and Pakistan. An indication of how quickly the national debt of Egypt is rising is shown by projections over the next 4 years. It was forecast to increase by nearly 70% between 2023 and 2028. In 2028, the national debt will have increased to $510 billion, an increase of $210 billion in the next 5 years. Now, Sisi repeatedly has told his people, believe me and believe only in me. And for a time, Egypt did. And now they're finding out they're paying for that belief grievously and personally, no matter what their background. Now Egypt exports its human misery around the Mediterranean. The current surge of migration to Italy includes a significant number of Egyptians who account for 1 in 5 disembarkations. According to data from Frontex, the European Border Agency, Egyptians were the most common nationality detected along the central Mediterranean route into the EU in the first 5 months of 2022. This is confirmed by the International Organization for Migration, who counted nearly 22,000 Egyptian migrants arriving in Europe last year. Last year, migrants from Egypt surpassed illegal immigrants from every other nation, including those from Afghanistan and Syria. Now, let's look at the same anniversary through the eyes of the sponsors, the rich Gulf states that funded the crushing of democracy around the Arab world, for the very simple reason they feared it arriving on their doorstep too. In foreign policy terms, we should ask not whether it was right or moral, but whether on a purely pragmatic scale it worked. Has it worked? Has it built an alternative to democratic government? What has the second generation of autocrats done with the power afforded them? Has installing Sisi worked? Obviously not. Egypt is economically on its knees. Did backing Khalifa Haftar work? No. He failed to capture Tripoli. What about the attempts to get rid of Erdogan in 2016? The UAE is now investing in Erdogan and in Turkey. And who came out of the siege of Qatar stronger, the Saudis or the Qataris? And now look at what's happening in Yemen, in Sudan, which has been torn apart by the Emirati-backed warlord Hemeti. Yemen is being eaten alive, with the Emiratis annexing the island of Socotra and encouraging southern separatists, demanding total separation from the north. A prisoner exchange and fragile peace has emerged between Saudi and Iran, and that is holding. But the real problem for Mohammed bin Salman in Yemen is not Iran, it's his neighbor, Mohammed bin Zayed. And then there is the Emirati funding of the Darfurian warlord Hemeti and the wrecking of Sudan as a country, which affects Saudi. Now, Egypt backed al-Burhan, but is powerless to stop the RSF rampaging around the country, even though the Sudanese army and the Egyptian army are cut from the same cloth, even though its officers went to the same military school, even though Sudan was once part of Egypt. That is how weak Egypt has got. It can't even come to the aid of its closest ally, Burhan. And both nations, Egypt and Sudan, are on their knees. So the result of funding coups and stoking civil wars is, in Sudan, more than 4,000 people have been killed and another 4.5 million people displaced in fighting between the Sudanese army and the RSF. No wonder this is of concern to Saudi Arabia and its vulnerable western shoreline, where all the key development and futuristic building is taking place. The key pact that funded the crushing of the Arab Spring is coming apart at the seams. And the two architects of the counter-revolution, MBZ and MBS, are not speaking to each other. In fact, they're at each other's throats. The war of words is constricted to licensed academics and trolls, but the tenor of it is unmistakable, at least from the Saudi side. It is, who are you, a rump of a country, to tell us, a big and real country like Saudi, what to do? The Saudis were the first to break the blockade against Qatar and did so without consulting the Emiratis. However, MBS is less free to reverse what he did and his U-turn on Egypt. He's fully aware that Egypt, under the control of the army, is a bottomless pit. But if you stop financing Sisi and Egypt collapses, he knows the exit of Egyptians would come his way across the Red Sea. If MBS was worried about the effect the Sudanese civil war could have on the west of his kingdom, he must be doubly concerned about the blowback to his kingdom from a potential collapse of the Egyptian state. Egypt is becoming a curse to Saudi, not the savior of the fight against political Islam. Now, 10 years on, there are important lessons for anyone like you who loves your country dearly, and those of you who remember how powerful your country once was and how far it has fallen in every sense: the security of its people, its economy, its society, its cultural life, its well-being. The first lesson is that you are on your own. The West is not a repository for values or higher standards. It's inward-turning, defensive, deeply divided internally with a rising right wing. Its leaders are pygmies. It prefers selling arms to dictators than backing Democrats. And anything that remotely disturbs their total support for Israel is also ruled out. Look how America behaved when it was in a much healthier state 10 years ago, before Trump, when Obama gave that rousing speech in Cairo. Look at how he and his administration behaved during and after Rabaa, refusing to call the military coup a coup. They attempted the same playbook for a few hours during one hot night in Turkey in 2016, when it appeared as if Erdogan's plane had either been shot down or he'd fled the country. Again, Kerry, same person, refused to call this a coup. The Egyptians are not alone. The political elite responsible for that debacle, I'm talking about the Western political elite, hadn't learned their lessons either. And for reference, do please, all of you, get a copy of Catherine Ashton's memoir of her time as the EU's High Representative of Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. It is called And Then What? Inside Stories of the 21st Century Diplomacy. Ashton was one of the last people to see Morsi alive. She describes her nighttime flight in a Black Hawk helicopter to Alexandria as if she were in some sort of Hollywood film. She told Morsi repeatedly there was no going back to the presidency, not even to resign, and he had to accept the coup. These are her quotes. He became agitated. He was the properly elected president, and as the constitution had not been suspended before he had been removed, there had been a coup. I went through the breadth of the coalition leaders who supported his removal and told him he needed to accept the new reality for the sake of Egypt. He rejected this as ridiculous. He said how sad he was that more than 200 people had died since he had left, and that he should be allowed to talk to his party. He urged me to talk to everyone and come up with a proposal that all sides could accept. I pushed back. I reminded him the country had been running out of time, that he as president had been running out of time. The situation was now complex, not clear-cut. What we could all agree on was trying to find a way to stop more people dying in the short term and help democracy flourish in the future. I'm keen to help, I said, but I won't interfere. The solution has to be an Egyptian solution. But he still didn't understand that there was no going back. The coalition that deposed him represented a massive part of the Egyptian society. Now, this account of their last meeting is a breathtaking renunciation of the principles that Ashton and the EU claimed to represent. Just 2 weeks later, Rabaa happened. The bloodshed didn't stop Ashton from having the most cordial relationships with Sisi, unaware, even today, of the grotesqueness of her words. She recounts describing this mass murderer as her philosopher general. Rabaa itself produced the mildest of rebukes from Ashton, who called on all sides to end violence and keep the possibility open for the political process. If anyone wants to understand the demise of Europe and what little remains of its authority, this book is required reading. To this day, the author is blithe about the disaster she oversaw in Egypt, Ukraine, and elsewhere. As a homage to stupidity, this is hard to beat. So lesson number one, expect nothing from Europe and even less from the West. But lesson number two is much more positive 10 years on. It is to believe in yourselves, not to give way to despondency, not to lose touch with the ideals that inspired you all a decade ago. You were right to support the Arab Spring and right to continue believing in it. Not just because democracy is the only way out of the death spiral of successive dictatorships in Egypt, Syria, Yemen, Sudan, Libya, Tunisia, but because dictatorship is weaker than it seems, even when Egypt's prisons are stuffed with 60,000 prisoners. Don't write off the Muslim Brotherhood. This is a very common mistake, because I, for one, know that Amas Kamal is not doing that. Not even he is confident he has slayed the Islamist beast. The fracturing of governments that came together to crush the Arab Spring has a very direct effect on each government's relationship to the Brotherhood and democratic forces they crush so cruelly. It represents a real opportunity. Just because they crushed Islamist and liberal forces alike doesn't mean that they think they are dead. I'm not enduring the enduring splits that make a reconstitution of Tahrir impossible, even after a decade of enduring the same fate at the hands of the generals. Maybe it needs a completely new generation. But Don't write off the democratic opposition force. Do everything in your power to make common cause with as diverse a group of exiles as you can, not in the name of your beliefs, but in the name of your country. In the words of that terrible First World War General Kitchener, your country needs you, and needs you as never before. You may not realize it, but change could come faster than you think. And each and every one of you needs to be prepared. Thanks for listening.